All right, packed house. Again, if you guys want to come forward, please do, and because this is going to be an intimate talk. My name is Jason Weeby. I'm the senior fellow with Bellwether Education Partners. Oh no, my Lego guy fell. I'd like to introduce Guadalupe, Guerrero, Kunjan, Narechania, Nikki, Lasley, and Matt Candler. And their bios are in the materials. We're going to skip over that so we can take up time with some of the interesting discussion that's in front of us. I encourage you guys, y'all to tweet. While we're up here, we all have handles with the Kunjan, you are social media, alpha social media, but everybody else has a Twitter handle, so feel free to amplify things that you thought were interesting. Send, tag people who you think might be interested in this, ask questions. That would be wonderful. Oh, is there one? An alt Kunjan? So please do that. Let me tell you a little bit about the flow of this panel. I'm going to give you an overview of the Innovation Index project that I led at Bellwether. And we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to hear from the city leaders that were profiled in two of the cities that we discussed, San Francisco and New Orleans. And then we're going to discuss, I'm going to largely hand it over to them and ask about what their real world experience is in their two cities and how education innovation manifests in those two cities. If you're a methodology nerd like me and you have read the Innovation Index, let's talk afterwards. That makes horrible panel conversation, but I'm happy to dig into the details later. And then if we have time, this is against ASU GSV protocol, but we will do some question and answer, or since it's a small group, if you want to come up, we can have a smaller offline conversation toward the end. Let me start off by saying Bellwether is a national education nonprofit, and what we do is we help education leaders make their most critical decisions, whether it's through strategic advising, talent advising, executive search, or policy and thought leadership. We help organizations all across the spectrum in the education sector. So let me dive in and tell you a little bit about how this started off as a little project, turned into a pretty big project, started. Having been in education my whole life and also living in San Francisco where innovation is just totally in the water, hearing a lot of the conversations in the education sector seemed very anecdotal and salesy when it came to innovation. The word innovation itself lost lots of its meaning because it could mean anything. And so that lack of rigor, and then being around it every day in San Francisco where there's money being invested, there are risks being taken, you have friends that are losing and getting jobs and starting things up and having success and failures and seeing this really dynamic ecosystem. I just didn't see the same thing in the education sector. And so having that front row seat and working in Bellwether conceived of this idea to actually try and measure the level of innovation in a city's education ecosystem. Of course, the other reason to do this is because we're failing our most vulnerable students on a daily basis. We're not moving fast enough. And so I personally believe that innovation, and especially rigorous innovation, is going to help us move faster in the education sector. So here are some of our big questions. What is innovation? Seems like a pretty elementary thing, but when you're thinking about measurement, you need to know what you're measuring so you can spot it. It's either happening or it's not. Is it important for education? My belief, of course, what I just said was it was important for education, but we weren't sure. We're going to test that. We're going to go to the literature for it. What can we learn from other sectors? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. How do we know when it's happening? And how do we do it well? And that last question is going to be a lot of the topic of conversation for us. So here's the definition that we came up with. And when I say we came up with it, first of all, we is myself and George Moo and Kelly Robson, my two co-authors. And we didn't really come up with this. Actually, the OECD came up with this. They came, they're one of the foremost leaders in innovation academics, and they have a definition of innovation. We tweaked it for the education sector. And this is what we came up with. It's the implementation of a new or significantly improved product, process, policy, organization type, organization model, or organization practice. Okay, this goes to the question about why we need innovation in education. This is scores from NAEP 2015. I'm going to cut to the chase. At the current rate of change, it would take 59 years to bring the average score for an urban Black 8th grade student up to proficiency in mathematics. 59 years at the current rate of change. So the current rate of improvement right now in our urban centers is not good enough. So what can we learn from other sectors? There are 6 primary lessons that came out of our research. And all of our work came from desk research, data analysis, and interviews with experts. So the first thing is that cities matter. Cities are the places where over half of Americans in poverty are concentrated. It's also where most of our financial and intellectual capital resides. It's also the place where policy actually gets put into practice. State level policy matters tremendously, but it's the local districts and charters and private schools that actually translate that into what matters for students. So the second one, change is good. This one's kind of controversial. So dynamism is a central concept in modern economics. The idea of creative destruction, you've probably heard of it before, and it explains how new, superior ideas replace obsolete ones that aren't working, and it's a constant churn. In other sectors, it's when stores or restaurants open and other ones close down based on their popularity. In education, it's not so straightforward. If you're talking about schools, this idea can get very dicey very fast. And if we're talking about nonprofits, it's no harder, but especially for education technology, things open and close all the time. But that idea that good new ideas are introduced into a market and bad ones are exited is crucial. So R&D, the US invests 0.15% of its federal education budget on R&D. In other sectors routinely spend between 10 and 30% of their sales revenue to create new products and services, dwarfed by what we do in education. There's even probably less at the state level, I would gather, and there are some foundations that are willing to take risks, that are willing to put risk capital out there, but not very many. Policies, so bad policies can be huge barriers to innovation. Good policies can rapidly accelerate them. For instance, policies that favor existing organizations over new entrants stymies innovation. Innovation-friendly policies like reducing the time and energy needed to get a new venture off the ground are hugely helpful. Innovation doesn't always produce winners. This is another one that's really problematic for the education sectors, because what this means is there are losers, and nobody ever wants our students to be the losers. So risk and failure is a really, really unpalatable, they're two really unpalatable ideas in the world of education, but also totally necessary for innovation. So there's a huge question about how we can mitigate failures, especially for our most vulnerable students, while still taking the risks necessary to produce new and good ideas. So in the last one, innovation is measurable. Measuring innovation and entrepreneurship goes back to the early 1800s. So we've got lots and lots of academic studies to stand on. So we know that it's measurable. We knew going into this project, this was one of my big questions, can we actually do this? And the answer was yes, and we had lots of really good examples to start with. So here's how we measured it. This is our theoretical framework. It's divided up into innovation conditions and activities. And I would just want to point out, some of them are self-explanatory, and if you look in the back of the handouts that you picked up on the way in, you can see how we actually measured these. So, but there's two I want to point out, or three I want to point out. One, the need for academic improvement. So the way we measure this is not by academic success, so the better you do, the higher you are. You score higher for the need, right? So it's counterintuitive. If a city has lots and lots of kids that are struggling academically, they're going to score high on need for academic improvements. We don't want that. The second one is district deviation. So this is a model or a novel measure that we came up with. We needed a way to use standardized data to figure out if districts were innovating. That's a pretty tricky endeavor. If you work with district data, there's very little that's actually common across all districts. But one thing is common, and that's expenditures and budget lines. So what we did was we basically took an X-ray of district budgets, and we compared budgets or compared districts against their peers in 8 budget lines, all of which would have a direct impact on learning. Like, these are things like how much you spend on teachers. And we compared them across peer districts. If a district, on average across all of those, was 1 standard deviation in either direction, that would signal to us that a district is allocating their resources in pretty different ways than their peers, and something's going on there. That's about as good as we could do with the data. So it's a blunt instrument, to be sure, and it's experimental, but it does tell us which way the wind's blowing. And with our anecdotal follow-up in the 4 cities that we measured to test this index, we think we're going in the right direction. And then the third one I want to talk about is dynamism. So again, we talked about this, introducing new ideas and getting rid of old ones. We applied this to education nonprofits. It's a lot easier. You have an ed tech startup, it starts up, you employ 3 people, it doesn't work out, you close. Like, that's painful for those 3 people, but it's not 700 or 800 students in a school that closes, right? So applying that same principle to schools is very, very difficult. It's the reason nobody wants to close schools. It's a painful process. But again, really crucial to innovation. So this is, we have a 9-point radar chart. This is how we visualize our data. So what we have here is a totally arbitrary demonstration of if a district starts in the top left corner and moves to the top right, and then the bottom left and the bottom right, you would see how they would improve. So actually, a city that scores perfectly on all measures looks like a nonagonal pie with a slice taken out of it. Okay? And that slice is need for academic improvement, right? You would hope to see that go down. I don't ever expect any city to ever score like this. But it is illustrative to know what perfect looks like. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the 2 cities in question. So the first, we'll start with New Orleans, and I want to point out a few things about New Orleans. First of all, y'all probably know most of the students that attend school in New Orleans attend a charter school. There's also a huge proportion of students, not huge, but bigger than you might expect, that attend private schools. Right now, there's still some students that attend district schools, and it seems like for another year there will be, right? Yep, at least. So that's really important because that issue of dynamism is playing out right now in New Orleans, and they are grappling with all of the issues that come along with that. But I do want to point out that they've done a pretty good job of cultivating a pretty constant supply of new entrants, new schools to start up, whether through expansion or training entrepreneurs to start their own school. They have a strong performance framework, and very importantly, there's a willingness to close poor performing schools. And a lot of those other things make the closing schools easier, but closing schools is never easy. It's very painful for a community. So they score very highly on dynamism. They scored highly on collaboration and coordination mechanisms. We consulted Matt during the design of the index. This is something that he brought up is very, very important. And I don't think I fully understood it until I was in New Orleans recently and got to meet so many leaders from different parts of the ecosystem and realize how often they collaborate, and they don't always agree, but they're all moving in the same direction. It's unlike any other city I've ever been to. Also, New Schools for New Orleans is one of the first harbor master or quarterback organizations in the education sector. Matt used to run it. It's done a tremendous job of aligning resources, creating urgency, and keeping everybody in the community laser focused on creating quality schools. And then very strong policies, strong charter law. The Recovery School District has done a tremendous job in New Orleans. They have a common enrollment. There are vouchers, course choice, and then really importantly, there's accountability and good execution going on there. So in contrast, San Francisco, where I live, my hometown for now, is, 'cause I'm from Detroit originally, I'm proud of it. The innovation culture is off the charts. So New York actually sets the bar in our measure for innovation culture. San Francisco is like a point behind that. And so when I say it's in the water, I mean like if you have been to San Francisco before, if you're from San Francisco, you might even take it for granted. But the level of risk that people are willing to take, there is no stigma attached to, or there's less stigma attached to failure. In some places it's a badge of honor. You see it everywhere. So that, they set the bar for innovation culture. And we'll talk a little bit about how much that permeates into the school district and the rest of the ecosystem. And there are lots of education convenings, education innovation specific convenings. There's probably one happening right now as we talk. There is no coordinating intermediary, and this measure is probably the one I'm least happy with because we can only measure things we can identify definitively, and so we picked a few of the intermediate or the coordinating bodies that we know of, like a Strive partnership, a Gates Compact, common enrollment system, a coordinating intermediary like a Harbor Master. San Francisco doesn't have those, but that doesn't mean that's not happening. So it doesn't show up here, doesn't mean it's not happening. And I can say with confidence this probably underestimates the level of coordination that's going on in San Francisco. And then as far as innovation-friendly policy goes, current California policy, there aren't as many choice mechanisms. There are charter schools in California, but they're not as supportive of new entrants. The authorizing laws aren't very strong. There's no course choice. There's no vouchers or ESAs. So the policy is different. And then on dynamism, this is one of the most interesting ones. So San Francisco scores very highly on dynamism, similar to New Orleans, but for very, very different reasons. So most of the dynamism coming from San Francisco is because of the nonprofit dynamism. So we measure two things for dynamism. One is the entry and exit of nonprofits, and the other one is the entry and exit of schools of any sort, district, charter, or private. And so where New Orleans scores high because of the dynamism in the body of schools, San Francisco scores high on the education nonprofit entry and exit. Whereas most of the schools in San Francisco are run by San Francisco Unified School District and largely stay the same. So actually, we can see an overlay here of the two. And so they score similarly in some domains and really differently in other domains. So San Francisco has a very strong culture of innovation, and San Francisco Unified, as you will hear, is doing a lot to take that culture and innovate within a district structure, whereas New Orleans has a much more dynamic, fluid environment based on setting the conditions and creating the activities so that schools and nonprofits can thrive. So what the big takeaway from this whole project for us and where I'm going to leave this is that innovation can happen and manifest in very different contexts, in very different ways. We don't have, this index was totally agnostic about school market share. So it didn't give any more points to San Francisco than it did to New Orleans. It weighted everything fairly. And we think, especially after going through this process, I firmly believe that just as much innovation can happen within a traditional district as it can in a very dynamic environment. They're just two very different ways of going about it. So now I want to turn to the experts. Thank you for listening to me go through all that stuff. And we're going to hear a little bit about how they're experiencing innovation in their cities. And then try and kind of get the true Hollywood story about am I totally wrong on this stuff? Am I right? What are we missing? Things like that. So please, again, if you're looking at your phone, we're just going to assume that you are on Twitter, loving everything about this panel. But you can also tweet questions to us as well, and we'll try and get to them afterwards. So let's start with the conversation. I'd love to, let's start with the San Francisco crew, all right? The home team. So Will you two just start, maybe Guadalupe, will you just start and talk that question about like the culture of innovation in San Francisco and how you experience that as a superintendent in a district and how and if it permeates the work that you do?
Yeah, I think I'll start by stating my title, Deputy Superintendent of Instruction, Innovation, and Social Justice. So I mention that only because it's not just overseeing, supervising, supporting a traditional portfolio of 126 schools. But the second word in there, innovation, is around endorsing, supporting, signaling that we want to pursue strategies that are going to disrupt persistent achievement gaps. You saw the line graphs. San Francisco is the top performing urban school district in California, and it also has the widest achievement gap. We also know that our students enter the system demonstrating K readiness that doesn't match their white and Asian peers as well. And then the last word in the title there around social justice, it's also important to think about innovation for whom. How do we remain student and equity centered in our focus as we pursue these ideas? So it is true, the San Francisco Bay Area is a hotbed for innovation. It's in the water. How does that permeate the school district? Is a good question. Everybody wants to be innovative. Everybody would like to see reform. Not everybody wants to change. But we believe we have gotten over the last number of years, as we've moved to a more coherent and unified approach beyond sort of idiosyncratic boutique school reform, to think about how do we take advantage of enough of the stars that seem to have lined up, both at the site, the district leadership level, in our local government, with our partners in various sectors in the city, and even at a larger level that allows us to really push the needle on things. I'll just give a few examples. When our graduation rate was not what we wanted it to be, we raised the standard for that. And now we have the highest graduation rate in the state, even though we elevated the rigor of the diploma. Because we realized going upstream that our students were entering kindergarten not where they need to be, we've expanded on early education. We continue to be leaders there. Because we knew the middle grades experience is so critically important, you're going to hear a little bit about the partnership we've been involved in with both our mayor's office and a key partner in reimagining what that work looks like. And just to be clear about it, as a school system, our Board of Education led a year-long broad community process to actually articulate a vision called Vision 2025, where we actually call out the aspiration for the graduate profile. And while we want all our students to master concepts and standards across grade levels, we also called out all those other skills that we believe students are going to require or need to have in order to be leaders in a city in which they live. So those are a few high-level sort of response to your question there.
So let me ask from a skeptic's point of view, and I bet there's some skeptics in here too, who say big, bureaucratic, large, urban school districts cannot be innovative just inherently. What do you say to that?
I would say that's probably true depending where you sit or what your felt experience is. I don't believe that traditional school systems can't lead the way or can't be innovative. I would like to think San Francisco has been quite open to integrating a lot of new movement in a number of different edges of the work. You see that both in our technology work, in our early ed work, in our language pathway work, in our career pathways work, all of which are oriented to giving our kids those real college and career readiness skills. So I would say we've been demonstrating, I believe, lots of examples of ways that we try to shed that stodgy perception that can be had of public school systems.
You think you're doing a good job?
I think our outcomes are certainly moving the right direction. The challenge for us is to make sure those outcomes are equitable. And so we're not satisfied until all of our students are enjoying the same kind of success. And particularly in the high school level, and we see this across urban districts in America, there's something about the Prussian model that doesn't work, especially for our brown and black kids. And so how do we reimagine that secondary experience so that there's relevance and engagement for our students and there's actually agency for wanting to come to school?
Thank you. Nikki,
Yes.
talk about that from your experience at having worked at Salesforce and at other philanthropies in the Bay Area. Do you see the innovation from the private sector getting into the schools?
I do. I think that, as Guadalupe mentioned, and you as well, being in San Francisco when there's startups literally on every block, and that culture of innovation and startup and moving fast and iterating is just permeating throughout the city, that it's hard to not get it to permeate through the school system as well. And I think San Francisco is really unique in that there was a real multi-dimensional partnership in the city. The mayor's office came together with Mark Benioff, Salesforce's CEO, and the superintendent, previous superintendent, to really come together and say, how do we make San Francisco a world-class school district? A world-class city with a world-class school district. And it's that sort of collaboration that I think helps with the innovation, because you get a lot of different lenses to weigh in on sort of being able to, one, push the needle forward for where places traditionally wouldn't go very far in more traditional school districts, but then also having the backing of the city and being able to move some levers so that you can really think outside the box and be able to leverage a lot of different agencies to move things forward.
Can you tell us just briefly about the principal?
Innovation Fund?
Yeah, the Innovation Fund. I'd love that.
So I was just actually having a conversation with a venture capitalist for a very large computer company, not represented on this table, about some work that they're doing with VR and AR in the education space. And they were like, yeah, we just kind of give the companies the money and just kind of fingers crossed and hope that it all works out. And I said, well, that's kind of like the Principal's Innovation Fund without the fingers crossing and hoping that it works out. But it's really empowering the school leaders to decide for themselves what they want or how innovation will look in their schools. So in San Francisco, all middle school principals receive $100,000 of unrestricted funding to innovate as they see fit. And that has sort of run the gamut from buying additional technology, paying for professional development support, partnering with other schools in the area to leverage those resources so that they can get additional tech support or other types of resources, getting kids to go to Washington, D.C., to go visit the Capitol, like things that had been sort of, I guess, the budget had just been slashed altogether. So giving urban kids the more traditional / innovative school experience based on what the needs are of that school.
Do the principals, are they equipped to lead innovation? Do they know how to prototype, to evaluate, to try new things when things are going sideways, how to intervene? So
it's been an evolution. I would say the first couple of years with the Innovation Fund, it's now in its 4th year, it really was, I think, everybody was sort of taken aback and like, oh, this is a lot of money. What do we do with this money? The first year, I think half of the principals didn't even spend all of the funds. Like they just weren't ready. Nobody was ready for that kind of funding. But since then, the process has evolved such that there is a plan put in place, and it's tied to the Vision 2025. So here's the long-term goal. How is this funding going to help you sort of get there, accelerate getting there faster? And it's mostly, I would say 85%, people are learning and trying different things, but there are very few areas where I'm seeing that there's one thing in particular I'm thinking of is a summer math program, but there are very few areas where principals have said, oh, we tried this and it's totally not working. Because I feel like part of the beauty of the Principal Innovation Fund is you really are empowering that leader to know what's right in their school. And for the most part, they do know what they need. And so it's just sort of giving them the space to be able to do that and the resources to do it. And it really has made a difference.
Just to add to the question, public school systems aren't typically set up with sort of a wing of R&D or to lead a design thinking oriented process. So I realized that several years ago and launched an innovation team. So we have an in-district iLab. We actually train a platoon of coaches in partnership with both the D School at Stanford, Berkeley iLab, IDEO, number of partners. We've developed a curriculum so that we can better equip folks at the site level or coaches that we can deploy to actually lead folks through an end user process so that they're actually making wise decisions about these investments. There's the Principal Innovation Fund, which provides over $2 million to our individual middle grades principals, but we also have other innovation funds. This past Friday night, we celebrated a showcase of end of year projects that were sort of on an RFP, elementary, middle, high, early ed, propose a challenge or a barrier that you're trying to resolve for, and we'll provide some Sprout money. So that those Sprout monies range from $10,000 to $100,000 to give you sort of the encouragement and the support to try out some things. And these innovation monies don't just apply to the educators or the leaders in the school system. We also have, in partnership with the Stanford Graduate School of Education, $1 million incentive fund. And that's to actually incentivize faculty to take on short cycle research projects to investigate questions that we have as a school system, so we actually can move and iterate on those in rapid cycle. So that's another way to kind of make sure the resources are helping to steer in actionable ways and make those tight connections between research and practice.
Yeah, just to really quickly piggyback on the research piece, I think the one thing I will say is as a funder, you have to have a tolerance for this innovation work, right? Like the Principal Innovation Fund, unrestricted. So you have to be able to be okay with saying, here, do whatever's best, and if it doesn't work out, it has to be okay. Not what did we get for the $2.1 million or whatever. You just have to accept that you're investing and then let it go in that same way as a VC.
Well, I asked about that because I think it's pretty rare that the unrestricted grants are given at the school level. I think it's rare that you're training people to be designers and innovators. And I love that. The innovation funds are something that we look for as signals that there's good innovation going on, but it doesn't always work out because it's hard for people to dislodge themselves from this conventional mindset of giving where we need to see the results. We need to see the needle move. It needs to happen right now, and because of direct impact of our money, innovation isn't a straight line. So let's go to New Orleans. Kunjan, how would you describe, and I'm going to ask you Matt, the same question. How would you describe New Orleans' brand of innovation?
Yeah, I mean, from a district perspective, we think about two questions. We think about how do we increase the number of high quality seats for kids? And second, how do we think about protecting the rights and meeting the needs of our most vulnerable learners? And we have a community of people who are constantly solving those two problems with us. And so you've got philanthropy, advocacy, school leaders, both at the sort of central charter school organization level and at the school level, engage on those questions with us on a regular basis. And so we, through that process, have gotten the number of kids in failing schools down from 62% to 6% in 10 years. And we have had a sort of variety of programs flourish in New Orleans that didn't exist there before. For example, a therapeutic day program, which we never had in our city, which is a partnership with Tulane Medical School, Youth Opportunity Center, which sort of finds kids who are truant and sort of brings them back into the system through case management and counseling. We have schools themselves doing a lot of innovation and innovative programming, and we have a member of our community in the audience, Andrea Bond, who runs a program that is a post-secondary program for kids with the most severe cognitive needs to help them transition to the workplace. So, we are constantly in a discussion about a whole host of solutions to the two original questions that I named.
And so you work for a state agency, the Recovery School District.
I do.
What do you see the role of the state agencies in fostering innovation at the city level?
Well, I mean, in our state, the state agency has basically let the Recovery School District do what I'm describing, which is figure out, in this context, how do you get more quality seats for kids and how do you protect the rights of the most vulnerable learners, and has served as sort of a buffer between community politics and the ability of us for us to get our work done. And that has been the biggest sort of help to us. We are not dealing constantly with the local politics that sort of, I think, burden the local system. Not to say that we aren't ever sort of caught up in the local politics. We often are, particularly when it comes to closing schools. But a lot of the decision making that we've done has been absent of an elected board having to bless those decisions, and that's because of the buffer our state board provides us.
Matt, you are as far away from the state, probably on the ground level, working with individual entrepreneurs. How do you see, what's the brand of New Orleans innovation from your perspective?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm proudest of that collaboration, coordination spike, right? I think our work doesn't have anything to do with reality of kids' lives unless Kunjan's doing like thousands and thousands of little tiny things to allow good ideas to thrive. And I think it's humbling to hear your list, honestly, because these deep needs, there's this sexiness to innovation outside the state and outside the district that a lot of folks are attracted to, but there's these systemic deep needs that tragically our iterative design thinking based approach still hasn't solved.
Yeah.
And so I think what's humbling about that intro is I'm proud of the dynamism spike, the collaboration and coordination spike. I would definitely like to fight you guys on the innovation culture spike. I mean, Jazz Fest just ended yesterday. Come on, give me a break. But, I think that if I was to describe New Orleans and sort of lay it down on top, I just love this comparison. So let's look at another index. And this is, I'll actually answer your question through this, which is food and drink. So the other innovation index upon which our two cities are constantly battling for first and second place is bars per capita, currently in the lead, and restaurants per capita, currently in the lead. So close second. No, yeah, we've had you on that. Yeah. Suggest you give up there. But, and this is the metaphor that I like to describe the world that I live in. And again, it's critical that my world connects to Kunjan's world. And one of the things I'm most proud of is a program we did last year where we ran pitch workshops and then granted investments in small teams of educators and parents responding to a list of 8 priorities that we worked with your team to develop. Yeah. And so we think, and I think in many other cultures or interpretations of the innovation culture, there's this sense of us versus them. I mean, I used to start charters for a living and used to duke it out with some of Guadalupe's colleagues. And like, we don't need your charters. No, we want you to, but your parents say we need them. So there's very much a us versus them element to a lot of innovation, chartering in particular. When you became the majority in New Orleans, you kind of had to stop bitching about the man because you are the man, to quote Jack Black from the greatest education movie of all time, School of Rock. But so back to the food metaphor. What we're doing at 4.0 and the way it connects to Kunjan and how this sort of all fits together, statistically, New Orleans spikes at 4x the national average in folks who self-identify as entrepreneurs. And I think a lot of that's due to the fact that just to be in this city, you had to be entrepreneurial. You got to fight FEMA. You got to get back home. Like people who are from this town, I'm not. I have so much respect for them. Like entrepreneurship, innovation is just literally in you if you are in that city by definition. You had to be an innovator to get back home. So I do think that we're way lower than 50-ish on that. But back to the food. So in the old days, when you want to start a bar or restaurant, you got to find $1 million and raise the money. Now what you do is you borrow your friend's restaurant, you do a pop-up meal, right? And then if that works, you go buy a food truck. And in many ways, to the extent that Kunjan's very much responsible for those spaces where restaurants, schools, learning spaces, specialized centers for kids with the deepest needs, she's responsible for that real estate. For when that idea is proven that she's going to give you space and give you access to those constituents, my role at 4.0 is I run the pop-up dinner investment and the food truck stages. And so we have to work together. I don't want to put up food trucks
that we
for areas of the cuisine. I'm pushing the metaphor, right? If Kunjan's like, dude, we got plenty of burger places. why am I wasting my time doing pop-up meals and food truck experiments in burgers? And like that just basic coordination of these are the systemic needs. Can you point the innovation engine to those gaps and fill them? That's the thing I'm proudest of, and I think that is the most unique thing, because I think she respects the work we do, she's accepting the failure, and we have a ridiculous amount of humility about that last spike, the innovation-friendly policy.
Yeah.
I will never, ever, if I am, I want you to call me and anyone else call me on whether or not those of us innovating don't understand how difficult it is to clear the decks and to get roadblocks out of the way. Because ultimately those little really annoying things, one app, good charter review, quick exit, thoughtful shutdown, there's so many, there's dozens and dozens of stories like that that mean that spike that blue innovation-friendly policy. And it's not, come open a charter here. It's what you mentioned, just those details about entry and exit becoming the norm.
The grain size is important, right? In ed tech, we see it more than in the rest of education, where there are angel investors, and then there are seed investors, and then you have different rounds of funding and go on up. In school models, historically, for the last 20 years, it has been you need $1 million for a planning grant to start a school. That's a pretty steep barrier to entry. So this continuum from trying something, during a summer school or a Sunday school, and then learning and working that way in is really important. I want to stay with you two for a second. What would you like people to know about the education ecosystem in New Orleans and the innovation that is happening there or that is possible that they probably don't know?
Well, I think one, people when they think about New Orleans, I think about charter schools, and we are 95% charter, that is true. But the real innovation in New Orleans is a governance innovation, and I think sometimes that headline gets missed. We are now a very lean central office. We run on 2% of the per pupil, which in New Orleans is a central office funded by less than $7 million a year. And we are a place where the schools have tremendous autonomy. And the central office does a lot of regulatory work. We make sure that schools are following laws and policies, but we also make sure they're achieving with kids and respecting the rights of all learners. And if you can't do that in New Orleans, you can't run a school in New Orleans, and we're very serious about that. But that model is a governance issue. There are traditional school systems that can adopt components of that model, and it is not reliant on charter schools only. And so I think that's number one. I think two, at the same time we built this open market of education, we kept a relentless focus on the most vulnerable kids. And again, I think people don't know that. You can't just say to schools, you can open anywhere and do whatever you want. You have to say to schools, you can open, but you have to serve every kid that walks through your door, and if you don't, that will be a problem. Two, you have to ensure that you've done everything possible to keep every kid you get in the building, because we won't let you kick kids out. And three, we will give you the funding that you need to serve those students by sort of differentiating how we allocate resources in the system, but that again comes with accountability. And so we have balanced free market with a really sort of like laser-like focus on the kids who are most in need in the system. And the last thing I'll say is, this has all been reliant on school leaders and teachers willing to sort of roll up their sleeves and take on every single challenge. And I cannot overstate sort of the importance of the leadership of our CMOs and the support that we get from the sort of surrounding community, Matt included, to allow those leaders to innovate and to sort of like, put everything they have into sort of ensuring that every kid can learn in our system.
I want to give Nikki and Guadalupe a chance to answer that same question. What do you want people to know about the innovative ecosystem in San Francisco they probably don't know?
I think we're always glad to sort of maximize larger investments in our work. I mean, we have to be very thankful for the citizens of San Francisco, even though there aren't a tremendous number of school-age kids, and a third of them go to private and independent and charter schools. Even though the other two-thirds, they continue to support parcel taxes and other ways of investing in our public schools. We're building 2-3 really innovative new schools. We're building a brand new art center that's going to serve all of our kids. We've got a new STEM middle school that's growing. and we have a couple more on deck. We're pumping in $100 million into our technology. Our CTO, Melissa Dodd, there is in the second row, that thinks about how do we bring our infrastructure and the hardware in the hands of our kids who most need this. We scored high sort of on the talent culture, and that is true. Annually, there's about 60,000 talented individuals coming in mainly to work in the tech sector. There's only a couple thousand housing units that are being built, so someone's getting displaced, right? And so the challenges and the affordability are very real, particularly for our communities of color and for our teacher workforce. And so it is a struggle. You know, people want to work as a part of sort of this mission that we're on in San Francisco in our schools, but you hear increasingly how difficult it is to be an educator. So we're always thankful to our partners, even the startups. They may not have a lot of capital, but they have people, and they're willing to circle our schools. We have a Circle the Schools initiative. I don't know how many at this point our schools have been adopted, but it's as simple as dropping by every Friday morning to mentor or read to a kid. Like, we'll take that any day of the week. It shows an investment in the public schools, and so that's always helpful. And then to address the teacher pipeline issue, we're launching a couple teacher residency programs so that we're growing our own. We're taking many folks from the community and also helping them earn their teaching credentials. So we have to stay competitive as well, so that's something we're in negotiations about. But to do this work and to bring the folks that have sort of the mindset for doing this more non-traditional work in our classrooms, we want to be able to attract that kind of educator and leader. And it's becoming tough in a city like San Francisco because public education doesn't yet enjoy sort of the same cachet.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Nikki,
Yeah.
we just tell me what you're hopeful for. Like, what do you hope for the education sector in San Francisco?
Yeah, a
going
couple of things.
forward?
I really quickly want to talk about, because the more I think about this collaboration piece, I'm like, there's so much that's not captured in the
You
work.
got hosed, didn't you?
I know, I feel like
Yeah.
we are doing so much. And
Weeby.
Guadalupe mentioned the Circle the Schools program. So SF City is a local agency in the city, and they created this program where companies can adopt a school. You go in, you commit to 4 to 5 activities a year. You can either, read on a Friday or do a bigger back to school event. It really gets the community invested in the schools. And at Salesforce, we actually adopted 20 schools, the whole, like most of the middle schools and a couple of high schools and like 3 middle schools, or elementary schools, sorry. And that really made a huge difference in terms of the employees feeling like they, even though most of them are skew younger, don't necessarily have kids in the district, but they're really invested in the community and really wanting to see San Francisco thrive. So in terms of what I'm hopeful for is that kind of investment in the community will continue outside of just Salesforce. Like there are, I think, 45 different companies that have invested, some of them very small startups. We had partnered with a couple of them to help get them off the ground, just to see it's not that bad. 4 to 5 events a year is definitely doable. So I'm hopeful that the tech sector, as it continues to grow and thrive, continues to invest in the community. I also really hope that we can figure out how to double down on that most vulnerable population of the Black and brown kids. Like, we know that it's a very small number, and I deeply believe that if we just all get in the room together, we can figure out, if we all take 10 kids, we probably could just have it all solved by now. But it's one of those things where it's something that it needs to be addressed. And so I'm really hopeful that with all this innovation work, we can figure out how to address that need.
So the conditions and the activities for innovation at the city level are really crucial. We know that in other sectors. We know it now in education. You've got 4 people in front of you that know this from their firsthand experience. We're out of time now, but I want to welcome you to come up and chat with us afterwards, or meet us outside, or grab us later for a drink. We'd all love to meet you and hear what you thought of today and what you do and how that contributes. So thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists. I appreciate y'all coming out to Salt Lake City.